In this video I will be talking about things that I actually liked in the Alien prequels. In all my previous videos I heavily criticized these movies, especially Prometheus, which in my opinion ruined the whole backstory of the original space jockey, which I think should have been a biomechanoid and that the whole ship should have been cybernetic, and I think they basically flushed that whole potential down the toilet and instead gave us bald albino bodybuilders who simply dress up as these amazing aliens, so that to me was extremely disappointing. As for the whole idea of them creating humanity, I also didn't like it because it basically made the whole universe seem smaller, everything was connected to humanity all along, so I didn't like this idea, but I would have accepted it if they still kept that element, that creepy Giger-like element of having them be mechanoids. I'd be fine with them looking like humans in the past, but I think they still should have been advanced cybernetic biomechanoids in the future. It would have fit perfectly into a horror atmosphere, and since these are supposed to be horror movies, it would have fit perfectly. And instead we got kind of a Star Trek-like idea, and I do appreciate Ridley Scott's attempts to make this story more than just about monsters, meaning to add some actual fantastical science fiction elements. So the idea of the creators of humanity on the one hand, and on the other hand the creation of humanity, meaning the androids, and also to add some variety to the actual xenomorph, not to have just the same old xenomorph again and again and again. I do agree with Ridley Scott that it wouldn't be scary to see the same exact creature again, and instead have a wider variety of different kinds of creatures. That is something that I do think was right. The problem in Prometheus was that all the other creatures were much less scary than the actual xenomorphs, except maybe that huge facehugger thing, that was kind of creepy, but apart from that all the other monsters were much less scary than the xenomorph. So we had some snakes, we had the worm in the eye, which by the way I do think came from Giger's ideas, because that is something that he actually talked about and was even in some of his drawings.
A worm in some, yeah, a worm in a living body. Oh, just under the skin, and you see how it moves. Ooh, oh, oh. Yeah, I hate worms and snakes and things like that. It's awful.
And so there were a whole bunch of creepy ideas like that, but each of them was much less scary than an actual xenomorph. And only in the very end we got something like a xenomorph, but it was no longer a part of the plot. It was just thrown in there just to show us like here is a xenomorph, but it was not involved in any way in the story, and not even in the sequel. So it was totally pointless. There should have been more monsters that are actually at least as scary as the xenomorph. And the only thing that actually came close was that tentacle monster, but it only appeared briefly, and so that's basically the only real monster in this movie. The engineers themselves also were not really scary. It was basically like a big humanoid, so it was no different than Jason Voorhees or something like that. And so it wasn't creepy, it wasn't scary. Maybe it would have been creepy if it was an actual biomechanoid, as I said it should have been. That would have made it far more creepy and scary idea.
One of the first things you start to think about when you're working on a movie like this is how much are we revisiting that look. I mean, clearly if we're showing the society of these engineers, which is Ridley's new take on what that, juggernaut ship, we're going to be seeing a lot more Giger, right? And that was our assumption going in. But as with other things, our geek fan presumptions were not necessarily shared by Ridley and Arthur. So there were ideas about engineer architecture and the styling of that civilization that initially were quite far from Giger, much more monolithic and much more kind of like heavy and simple.
So at first the Giger component was almost inexistent because we really went into an architecture that looked as if it was the Giger stuff, but that had been cleaned out. The engineer's place was clean, spotless. We really went into what's the base of that Gigerish architecture without it, without those details.
Ridley had a very specific vision, so I didn't feel the need to challenge. But then there were times where I thought, well, let me just squeeze in a little Giger, just a touch.
More and more Giger kind of crept back in, and truthfully we kind of tried to shoehorn it back in. We would always kind of try to peddle whatever influence we had with Ridley and Arthur to kind of, stuff it back in.
And I think that was really a smart move. And we infused it with that very heavy Gigerish style. And I think Ridley at that point was also more ready for it. I think he just didn't want the Giger style to be the driving force behind the look.
And so this movie was a disappointment, but what I did like in this movie was the character of the android David. I think he was very well done. Fassbender is a great actor. His body language, his subtle facial expressions, all of that was perfect. And I even felt like he's channeling Brent Spiner's data in his performance, so I wonder if it was deliberate or simply he was trying to play a robot, and Brent Spiner also did the same, and so maybe that's the reason for the similarity. But I really felt like he was actually trying to imitate data from Star Trek, only with a slightly evil twitch. And so that was one of the things that basically saved Prometheus for me. Also, I did like the visual style of the movie. I think Ridley Scott is a very good visual director, meaning he knows how to show a scene. He also used a lot of practical effects, and so everything looked really good. So visually I love the movie, but the ideas in it were not really fleshed out, not really done properly, and also the movie basically raised a whole bunch of questions without bothering to actually answer them, and not even in the sequel, which was even more disappointing in that sense. Alien Covenant basically ignored all the questions raised by the first movie, by Prometheus, and simply tried to wipe it all away, which felt like a total cop-out. The way they got rid of Shaw was basically like Alien 3, so they basically killed her off screen, which I actually kind of liked because it kind of mirrored what happened in Alien 3, so it kind of fits the whole tone of this movie series of being like a much more darker, nihilistic, horror-filled universe, so always the worst possible scenario happens, and so any character you love ends up dying in some horrible way, and so I actually kind of like it in a way. I just wish we would have actually seen more of their interaction before he actually killed her. I know there is a scene which was not in the movie, unfortunately, that actually showed the Shaw repairing David. I think that should have been in the movie. So I didn't like the fact that Alien Covenant didn't actually answer any of the questions raised and only created more confusion. And the whole idea of David actually creating the xenomorph, I do understand why many people are angry at this. I was also very angry at this when I first heard about it, but once I thought about it, I realized it's not really what the movie is saying. Like, Prometheus already showed that the xenomorph already existed in a sense. You saw that the black goo is basically creating it whenever it interacts with humans, and so it's not as if David created it from scratch. David simply modified it. I personally prefer to think that the xenomorph was actually a species which existed before, which the engineers found and tried to exploit, meaning to take their superior biology and to incorporate it into their black goo weapon, and then something went wrong and then it killed them. And what David basically did is basically extract the xenomorph out of the black goo and recreate it as its own species. And so I prefer to think that he simply recreated the xenomorph and not create them. That would also solve any continuity problems with Alien vs Predator. That would also allow for the possibility to actually see where they came from originally. And so David maybe thinks that he is creating the xenomorph, but in fact he is simply purifying it and recreating it, so in my opinion. And I do actually kind of like the idea of him creating them because, as I said in one of my previous videos, I never got it why the space jockey would use the xenomorph eggs as a weapon. Like, it makes little sense to me to create a monster to destroy other planets when you have this advanced technology. Wouldn't it be easier to create a virus to do it? And so the black goo is basically a virus, so the black goo actually makes more sense as a weapon than using just the eggs directly. The eggs would also be much less effective in my opinion, and so showing the black goo working as an actual virus spreading in the air and infecting everybody makes a lot more sense actually. Also, if they deliberately wanted it to create monsters, that would really make them very sadistic. And since they are humanoids and they created humanity, I don't think they are that evil. And so I always thought that it would really take like a very creepy, sadistic mind to actually create something like this. And so having the character of David being like an android who went nuts and who loves these xenomorphs and wants them to take over, he views them as a superior biological species, and so he deliberately wants to upgrade it and wants to spread it around. That actually kind of makes sense, so I actually kind of like the idea of him being behind all of this, and he views it as something beautiful, and we as humans view it as something horrific, something sadistic. But since he has no morals, he's simply an android, he doesn't view it as something evil, and so I find this whole idea kind of interesting, and so I don't mind it so much. Also, I think it ties well with Ash in the first Alien movie, because Ash said that it's a perfect organism, that he admires it, so if it was made by another android who thinks the same way as Ash, that would actually kind of make sense. And so this shows that all these androids kind of think the same way, so it kind of fits together well, I think. Also in Alien Covenant we've seen that the second android, Walter, actually speaks in a very similar manner to Ash.
Let me do mine, yes? You released it, yes?
And so I really love that part because it kind of showed us that all these androids are basically very similar to each other, and so I think it ties well with Ash in the first movie. We've also seen that he has some kind of strange sexual fetishes, like when he attacked Ripley he didn't just kill her, Instead, he tried to push a rolled up magazine into her mouth, and so it seems like he had strange, weird sexual fetishes toward humans. And so we see the same thing with David when he attacks Daniels. He seems to want to mate with her or something. It's also implied that maybe he tried this with Shaw and she resisted, and maybe that's why he killed her. And so that's another similar trait, that all these androids do have some form of sexuality which is oppressed, and so maybe that's why he modified the xenomorph to be kind of a sexual creature. That is something I also talked about, and I explained that the xenomorph is basically like a sex monster, and I think that's what made the xenomorph such a creepy monster, that it's not just a killing machine, instead it wants to basically mate with you in a horrible way. So I think that's what made it so creepy. So if it was actually a product of some crazy android who had weird sexual fetishes about reproduction with humans, it would actually kind of make sense. And because he has no morality, he has no problem creating something which is so horrific, so sadistic. He has absolutely no problem with them. He doesn't like humans. He viewed humans as his enslavers. And that's why I don't really hate this idea. I am kind of fine with it. I just hope the sequel will actually answer all the dingling questions which were left by these movies. These movies basically created a whole bunch of continuity problems with the other movies. Like, how would you explain that humanity never found any of those other planets? How come they never found the planet with the engineered ships? Did the Weyland never tell anyone where he was going? Like, no one else in the company knew where that planet was. How come they never sent any more ships there? It doesn't really make sense. Also, with this Paradise Planet, how come no one ever sent any other ship there? So if there's so much of this technology spread all over the place, and all these xenomorphs have been all over the place, so how come humanity had such trouble finding them again later? So it doesn't really fit with the other movies. So I hope the sequel will actually answer all these questions and tie it all in a way that makes sense. Maybe that movie will never be made, and then we'll have to make up our own theories to explain all of this. And so that's the problem with these prequels. So I don't really hate them. I enjoyed a lot of things in them. I did find them disappointing. In Alien Covenant we had a different kind of xenomorph, but it wasn't really, again, it wasn't really scarier or better than the actual xenomorph we know. It was just slightly different. I think it was actually less scary, and so again it was kind of disappointing. I wish they would have actually shown us a whole variety of different kind of xenomorphs. So once again, this was kind of a missed opportunity. So all we basically got was some snakes, we got a worm in the eye, we got someone who turned into a zombie, and we got a tentacle monster and a humanoid engineer. So that was all we got in Prometheus. And in the very end, when it had nothing to do with the plot, we got something like the xenomorph. But again, it looked much more stupid in my opinion. Also, its double jaw looked kind of impractical and useless. And in Alien Covenant we saw the neomorph, which was really not in any way scarier than the actual xenomorph. And in the very end we had just a regular xenomorph. Another thing that I liked in these movies were all the little connections to the old movies. Also, as I said, Walter kind of reminds me of Ash in the way he speaks.
Let me do mine. Yes? You released it, yes?
Also, there were other things that were similar to the original scenes. In some instances they were done even better. The way they showed how this helmet actually melts from the acid, it looked really good in my opinion. That is something we didn't actually see in the original Alien. We didn't actually see how the facehugger got through the helmet, and so I really loved how they did it in this movie. A lot of the designs in this movie were actually based on Giger's old works. That structure looked a lot like some of his paintings, even though in his actual paintings it was supposed to look kind of like a pregnant woman. So the only problem that it was done in kind of a minimalistic, simplified way in this movie. They should have gone all out with it, show like actual worms crawling underneath the skin like what Giger actually described. And they like showed like a tiny glimpse of it. They only showed it in his eye for a second. I didn't even notice it the first time I saw the movie. Like, it was too little, too quick, barely noticeable. So I don't think that's what Giger would have done if he was making the movie. What they should have done is something I discussed in my previous videos. They should have actually showed the civilizations of the engineers as being biomechanoids. That would have been so great to see in the actual movie. So that was a huge missed opportunity. I will never forgive this movie, and I will never forgive Ridley Scott for not actually doing that. And as for the engineers, there was one redeeming quality. As I said, it was hugely disappointing for me to see that they are basically just humans in suits, and they were not actually biomechanoids. But one thing I did like in the design, if you actually look closely, you see that that pressure suit he's wearing actually seems to kind of merge with his skin perfectly. This is something I do like. This is something that does look like some of Giger's work. Kind of a very gradual, smooth transition between the mechanical and the biological, and so that suit kind of merges with the body perfectly. So I do like that aspect of it. That's probably the only thing I liked about the engineer's look. So at least they did something right in my opinion.
You alright? Jesus, so is your neck.
So other similarities with the older movies, there were some scenes which were kind of deliberately trying to imitate scenes from the other movies, and so I kind of like it. So let me show you an example.
Why don't we just get her head and shove it through that fucking wall? As I don't really have anything to contribute in the gigantic dead body arena!
So as you see, it was kind of similar, so I don't think it was by accident. There were a lot of stuff like that. When they killed that guy who turned into a monster, they kind of drove over him, and it was very similar to the scene in Aliens. So there was a lot of like visual stuff like that, which was kind of deliberately similar to the scenes in other movies. It's like poetry, it rhymes. So I think I said and showed everything I wanted to. In my next video I will be discussing similarities with Star Trek, especially with the Walter and David story. I think it was very similar to data and lore in Star Trek. So in my next video I will be analyzing that in more detail. So that's coming up next.